Well, I want to welcome you back to another session of Little Gems. And just as a reminder, if you're tuning in, make sure that you like this YouTube page and hit the subscribe button and turn on the notifications. And that way, whenever a new video gets posted, you'll be notified about it. The text that we're going to look at today is from Hosea chapter 13, verses 12 to 14. This is a text with some challenges to it, but certainly a text with a beautiful promise that I want to look at especially. So let's just begin by reading the text. Hosea chapter 13, beginning in verse 12, we read, "The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up, his sin is kept in store. The pangs of childbirth come for him, but he is an unwise son. For at the right time he does not present himself, at the opening of the womb. I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes." Now, as we've been going through the book of Hosea, of course, we've been in this chapter where there have been a lot of pronouncements of judgment to come against the people of Israel for their sin. And of course, as we can see here, those announcements are continuing. In verse 12, we see that Hosea and the Lord through Hosea is talking about the iniquity of Ephraim and their sin being kept in store. And then we have this description or way of characterizing what's going to happen to the nation of Israel. And it uses this image of breech delivery. So notice with me again in verse 13, it speaks of the pangs of childbirth coming for him, but then it brings an indictment against him as being an unwise son. And as this is unpacked, what we find is what makes him unwise is that it's time for him to be born at the right time, at the proper time. It's time for Ephraim to be born, but he does not present himself at the opening of the womb. So again, this is speaking about a breech delivery. Whenever a baby is to be born, you want that baby to be coming out head first. Because if the baby is turned in the wrong direction, if it's coming feet first or if it's coming bottom first, the baby is most likely going to suffocate and die. And Ephraim here is described as that breech baby. And the result is inevitably that he's going to die. Death is coming for Ephraim. Now, it's when that judgment, that announcement of judgment is made, that Ephraim is going to die, it's as soon as that announcement is made that we then come to this little verse right here. And this verse, in verse 14, if you read through many commentators, there's often much debate as to whether or not this passage or this verse is a further announcement of judgment, or is this a promise? Now, if you have an older version of the ESV, the ESV 2011, these first two lines are phrased as a question. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? And the reason that it's phrased as a question is because the translators, as well as many other commentators, are interpreting verse 14 as a further pronouncement of judgment. And so the implied answer to those questions would be no. God is not going to ransom them from the power of Sheol. He's not going to save them from death. They're going to die, and that's going to be all there is to it. And part of the reason why commentators and various interpreters throughout the history of interpretation of this passage have come to that conclusion, among other reasons, is because of this last statement here. Compassion is hidden from my eyes. It's hard to make sense out of how verse 14 could be a promise of some kind of future work of salvation, some kind of resurrection promise, if the verse ends with this statement here: compassion is hidden from my eyes. Well, I want to just remind you that throughout the book of Hosea, it's actually not uncommon to find pronouncements of judgment right next to promises of salvation. And one of the places where you can see this, that there are actually several throughout the book of Hosea, but one of the places that you can see this is in Hosea chapter 1 and verses 8 really through verse 11. And in Hosea chapter 1, beginning in verse 8, Hosea has been describing the people of Israel as this prostitute of a wife, Gomer, as well as her children. Right? Gomer and her children are, in essence, parables or symbols of the nation of Israel. And in verse 8, the text says, when she, that is Gomer, had weaned no mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, call his name not my people. And then he explains why. For you, again, referring to Israel, are not my people, and I am not your God. So obviously, verse 9, very clear passage describing judgment. The Lord is no longer considering these wicked people to be his people. Right? And this child that is born is going to be a constant testimony, a constant reminder of that very truth. But then in verse 10, the very next verse, we read a promise. Verse 10 says, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And then if you skip down as the text continues in verse 11, it says, and the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head. And then listen to this. It says, and they shall go up from the land. They shall rise from the land or from the earth, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Very early on in the book of Hosea, again, you find this pronouncement of judgment followed immediately by a promise of salvation. And it's very interesting to note that in verse 11, as this promise is being made, there's this early hint, this early description of resurrection. The people of Israel, who are at this point not considered God's people, are eventually in the future going to rise from the land. And I think something similar is going on here towards the end of the book of Hosea, right, in chapter 13, verses 12 to 14. God, using this description of breach delivery, is in essence saying that the people of Israel are going to die. Death is coming against them as he sends the Assyrian Empire against them to be his instrument of judgment. Death is going to befall them. And of course, that's going to come upon everyone. Everyone is going to suffer under the consequences of this national judgment. Even, of course, even if you were a genuine believer, if you were a part of the remnant of righteous Israel who did not bow the knee to Baal and was not an idolater, if you were a true worshiper of the Lord, you were still going to suffer under these judgments because they were coming against the entire nation of Israel. Right? But as he announces that death is coming, then immediately what we see in verse 14 is a promise. And of course, especially a promise that was intended to be held on deeply by the people who trusted in the Lord. And this promise is that, in essence, even though you may die, death will not win. I, the Lord, will again ransom you from the power of Sheol and redeem them from death. Right? They had been redeemed before. The people of Israel had been redeemed before, and they had been redeemed by a great work of God, particularly in the Exodus. They were slaves in Egypt, and God, by his power, redeemed them from slavery. They're going to go into exile. They're going to be slaves to the Assyrians. They're going to be living in a foreign land, and yet again, he will redeem them from exile. But even greater than a redemption from the chains of being under tyrants in a foreign land, even greater than that, God promises his people that in the future he will redeem them from death itself, that the greatest chains of all will be broken by the very hand of God. And another thing that indicates that this is in fact to be read as a promise is the taunt that we find here. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? In the last passage that we had looked at in chapter 13, we saw that there was a taunt against all of the kings and the rulers of Israel because they would be unable to stop the judgments of God coming against the nation. He's too mighty. No one can stop the hand of God. And yet here, those taunts are turned against death itself. Right? Death will be defeated. Right? And so the reason, then, when we come to this last statement, compassion is hidden from my eyes, the reason we find this here is because it indeed will happen that death from a breech delivery, this image, again, of breech delivery, death will come. God is not sparing the nation from death, but in the midst of that death coming upon the people, he will redeem them. And a great promise will be fulfilled, that death will be defeated. Now, of course, this particular promise is picked up in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, right, by the Apostle Paul. And there in 1 Corinthians 15, particularly in, I'll write this down for you, 53 to 55, the Apostle Paul is talking about the resurrection to come, of course, because of the work of Christ defeating the grave. And he speaks about this day that will come when the perishable body puts on the imperishable. And he says that this mortal body must put on immortality. And in verse 54, he says, now when this happens, when this perishable puts on the imperishable and this mortal puts on immortality, then at that time, the saying that is written will happen. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? He's, of course, quoting from Isaiah 25, verse 8, and this very text we have before us. Right? So the Apostle Paul is very clearly indicating that this text in Hosea will be fulfilled at the last day when Christ comes and redeems his people from death itself and tells them to rise from the grave, and the grave will not be able to keep them. They will be raised from the dead. Death will be defeated, and they will live with Christ for all eternity. Death will not have the final word against God's people. So again, in the midst of this judgment coming upon all of the land, coming upon, in essence, Israel's world, right? God makes a promise that this will not be the end. And for the Christian, particularly today, this is a promise that we still cling to and hold on to. Because even though we live in this world that is indeed suffering under the just judgments of God against sin and unrighteousness, even though we have to live and endure various afflictions that are the result of the curse that has come upon the entire world, again, against sin, yet we can hope, and we can hope in Christ, because he has defeated the grave, and he has also promised that we who trust in him will also rise from the grave. And so, friends, you can cling to that promise and hope in it from now until that day arrives.